Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Emil and I use they, them pronouns. Today's webinar is Hate Matters, the impact of that hate has on domestic and sexual violence advocacy. So welcome everyone again. Thank you so much for being here today. As we get started, based on the title of this training, you may know that we're going to talk about anti-trans hate violence. We're going to talk about domestic violence and sexual violence, though mostly, kind of in broad terms of the impact that it has on people and the kinds of services we can provide. But even so, that content we know can be tough to hear sometimes. So please, throughout this training, take care of yourself. We are recording today. The video will be available in about a week or two for you to watch, at your leisure. We'll also share out links in the chat and follow-up resources. You can always reach out with questions. So if you need to step away or zone out for a little bit as part of your self-care, please go ahead and do that. Participation is totally optional. I am someone who loves the chat box and I love the emojis and reaction buttons. So feel free to use them as much as your heart desires. And I know that participation for some people means listening. Maybe it's taking notes, maybe it's quietly absorbing, and that's awesome too. So, whatever is going to help you learn the best today and take care of yourself the best today is welcome. And thank you everybody for the introductions in the chat already. It's so cool to see such a range of folks here. And again, these recordings will be available afterwards too. So again, my name's Emil. I'm a program coordinator with Forge. Forge is 30 years old. We are a national trans-led anti-violence organization. Our work includes providing training and technical assistance and creating resources for service providers to better be able to support trans and non-binary survivors of all types of violence. We started working primarily in domestic and sexual violence, but we know that trans folks' lives are impacted by a lot of different forms of violence. So over those 30 years, our work has expanded. A small part of our work also continues to be direct service to trans and non-binary communities. So all of the work that we do and share is routed in our connection with and being a part of and listening in community with trans and non-binary survivors. We're national in scope, started in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've got folks on, the West Coast and the East Coast. I am that dot in Florida, so when I'm talking, you may hear some Florida-centric stories. And for those of you who are in places that have some tough policies and laws coming out, know that we're here with you and we're familiar with those. At Forge, our guiding principles are to be trauma-informed, empowerment-based, and culturally responsive. These we hold true in our work with survivors and community members and service providers. We seek to understand the ways that trauma impacts everyone, survivors, service providers, and how we can respond in ways that support healing and avoid re-traumatizing folks. We support empowerment, choice, and agency, including things like, you choose how you want to participate today, what you want to share in the chat, and that our, ideas around supporting survivors are based on empowerment. We also recognize that trans and non-binary folks come from a wide range of cultures, and there's no one unique trans and non-binary culture. So we may strive to make sure that our work is responsive to a lot of the different cultural identities and lives that people are bringing to their work and to their needs as survivors. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a little bit of what are we talking about and why, right? What is state-sanctioned hate? What is kind of the United States like for trans folks right now? And then we'll look at how that anti-trans hate impacts our work in domestic and sexual violence advocacy. So the impact on survivors, on staff, and on services, and then think about what we can do about it. And we've got some resources that we'll share at the end. Um, just to do a little bit more introduction with y'all, we'd love if you could take a second and answer this poll. The first question is, how familiar are you with anti-trans hate violence? And the second is, how often have you worked with trans or non-binary survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault? I'll just give you like 10 more seconds. See if we can get a couple more people to answer. All right. I'm gonna end the poll. Um, so looks like most folks are very or somewhat familiar with anti-trans hate violence. I will talk through that some, but please, in that section, share what you know too, and ask questions about the stuff you don't know. And it looks like most people are in the I've occasionally worked with trans or non-binary survivors. And again, I just want to welcome all these ranges of experience. All of us are constantly still learning. Those of us in the often and very familiar category, we've got stuff to learn. And those of us in the not that familiar and never category have stuff we've learned that we have to offer. So please share your insights in the chat, share your questions, so that we can, build this community of learning, of like supporting survivors together. Great. Okay. So, as kind of a framework for what I want to talk about today, pulled out these three principles behind our work. The first is to believe survivors. And I'm seeing that most people work in, domestic or sexual violence roles or similar organizations. So we hear this refrain, believe survivors, a lot. So in addition to believing survivors about the violence they experience and not blaming them for that violence, it's also important that we believe survivors about their experiences of gender, of their experiences around hate violence and discrimination and harassment, and that we're not questioning people or forcing them to prove that stuff to us. We know that gender looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, and we want folks to be able to express that, and be themselves in the ways that they want to be with us. Another important principle throughout this training and throughout kind of our work with survivors is to recognize connections. First, people are connected, and the issues of our lives are connected. So this means that we want to be open to understanding how other issues relate to our work. That's when our work is primarily domestic violence or sexual assault. This could be things like hate violence, things like trans rights, even climate change or housing, or lots of different things that folks may be organizing for can be connected and have an impact on our primary fields of work. We also know that, as we are connected, that we're going to be impacted by the work that we do and the world that we live in. As staff, as volunteers, as advocates, you're connected to the folks that you work with and care about, and so are likely impacted by what happens in their lives and what's happening in the world as a whole. That's a normal thing, and it's something that we can plan for and take into consideration in how we take care of each other and how we show up for survivors. We also want to create a culture of care. So when we can put caring for each other at the center of our work, That can help us recognize and respond to a variety of experiences, reactions, and needs that survivors may have. To me, this means that we think about everyone has a right to safety, to food, to shelter. And so, how can we have that show up in our work? How can we make it so that our work is grounded in helping meet people's needs and building connection? So those are kind of the ideas that we'll string through as we talk about like the direct impacts of hate on domestic and sexual violence, and like think about as we think about what we can do about it. All right. So anti-trans hate is really ubiquitous right now. And it's been helpful for us to kind of break apart like what does that mean? So on this slide, there's three kind of circles. The first being state-sanctioned hate. So state-sanctioned hate looks at the stuff that is endorsed or perpetuated or reinforced or coming from the government, law enforcement, legislation, the media, and um, so it's systemic and institutionalized harm. We'll take a look in a second about some of the legislation examples. It's also things like Department of Health policies or things we're seeing in schools with what can be taught and what can't be taught. And all of that, also contributes to like a culture of hate. When we're seeing things come from the government, from the mass media, it contributes to this overall culture. We talk about anti-trans hate. We also want to look at hate violence, often in more of the ways that we might think about hate violence or hate crime. Not all hate violence will be classified as hate crimes just because of the way the government classifies things as crimes. But this includes interpersonal violence, harassment, discrimination. We're seeing a lot of trans and non-binary people being attacked by one person or attacked by a group of people, both in person and online. We're also seeing a lot of hate that's coming in the form of attacks on organizations and agencies, including service providers. So this looks like protests outside of healthcare facilities. This looks like bricks thrown through the windows of LGBTQ centers, as well as, you know, parents trying to get prevention educators kicked out of schools. And it's often only one or two parents. But the attack on the overall organization providing the service. And all of those things compound and reinforce each other, right? People are getting away with some of these things because there's this culture of hate. I'm just going to pause for a second, look at the chat. So we have a question here. State-sanctioned hate would be known also like rape culture, right? And yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we can learn from those too. So in my experience, rape culture kind of refers to broad kind of cultural ideas that make it so that victims are and survivors are blamed for sexual violence and kind of perpetuate norms that go against consent and contribute to the high rates of sexual violence in the world. So anti-trans hate, there's like cultural norms that are kind of similar that perpetuate that violence and hate. And then there's also similarly some legal policies or decisions by lawmakers, by the criminal justice system and stuff like that, that contribute to violence or keep us from preventing violence, such as, who gets prosecuted, sorry, for crimes or things like that. So yeah, if that analogy is helpful for you, I think there's a lot of similarities in how we understand that culture of violence. Um, so this is one way to look at some of more in depth at the state-sanctioned hate. The Movement Advancement Project is one of several organizations that has been documenting legislation throughout the country that targets LGBTQ folks. And they created a report called Under Fire, where they pulled together some of the major strategies being used in this legislation. Um, just for reference, you know, over 500, I think over 600 laws targeting trans people have been proposed in legislation um, across the country this year. Of course, not all of those pass, but that's still a huge number. And we've found, as we make slides for trainings and then lead the training a month later, like the slide's totally out of date because there's just that high volume of legislation. So what the legislation is trying to do, as a quick summary, is broadly all put together is to make it so that trans folks can't participate in public life. And they do that by blocking education in school. So keeping folks from being out in schools, determining what bathrooms, what public facilities folks can use, threatening to out students to their parents. They do that by erecting barriers to making change. So we've seen a lot of kind of attacks on voting rights, the bans of different types of protests or even wearing masks, like the things that people do that can try to gain trans rights are being made harder and harder to do. We're seeing enshrining of inequality. So legislation, for example, that says this is what it means to be a man and this is what it means to be a woman, and is denying the existence of intersex people totally, as well as trans folks, and makes it so that folks do not have the same access to legal rights anymore. Also, we're seeing criminalizing and banning of transition. So tons of attacks on healthcare for adults and young people. Also attacks on things like changing your name or your gender markers on identification, which can be really important, not only to people's self-affirmation, but to their safety. And then we're also seeing the silencing of supporters. So we've seen, a lot of these things are connected, but we've seen teachers lose their jobs for displaying a picture of their spouse or using their affirming pronouns. We've seen people, threaten to lose their job because they're speaking up for trans rights. So all of those things are kind of working together and reinforcing each other to create this really intense culture. And that can kind of be summed up by a quote from a lot. The best way to eliminate a group is to demonize them, such that their disappearance is seen as an act of justice, not discrimination. And if you haven't seen this person before, they're an amazing performer, artist, speaker who talks about gender as well as the history of gender, and just has lots of like brilliance and beauty in their work. So somebody definitely to check out. So I'd like to take a pause here and hear what y'all are seeing in your communities. I see we've got people from a lot of different places in the country. What types of anti-trans actions are you seeing or hearing about? I see one in the chat that I'll read out. Something that seems to often be invisibilized is the hate faced by incarcerated trans and gender nonconforming folks, especially from a state-sanctioned strategy. Putting trans folks in jails and prisons that don't align with their gender, denying gender-affirming medications and overall care, and increased solitary confinement rates. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. And there's a clear correlation there with sexual violence. We know that trans folks face a lot of violence in jails and prisons and incarceration facilities, and especially forcing folks to be in a jail or prison that is not safe for them, or denying medical care or putting people in solitary confinement does not increase their safety at all. couple other comments. There's a lot of violence against Black trans women here. Absolutely. We see, as y'all keep chatting, I'll bring in this next slide. We see a really strong connection between oppression and interpersonal violence. And so when you add on multiple layers of forms of oppression like racism, along with transphobia, we're getting even higher rates of violence. Uh, just to summarize a couple others, conversations about bathrooms, extreme violence for foster youth, parents of trans adults denying the adult-child reality, not being allowed to come into schools to teach and talk about gender, no access to safe shelter, sober living, not allowed on sports teams. Y'all are very knowledgeable about this. Please keep adding in the chat, and hopefully folks are able to see everybody else's comments too and learn from each other. So what we take a moment and digest. A lot of the things we're seeing are stuff we'll talk about in a minute, but really denying folks, like kids' right to be kids, to go to school, to use the bathroom, to talk about their parents, to talk to their parents. We're seeing a lot of denial of people's access to support, whether it's things like shelter services, sober living, see some safe foster care. We're also seeing things that impede people's access to interpersonal support. So community beliefs or the rules that are being put on teachers to out students make it so that young people don't have safe adults that they can talk to. They may be afraid of getting taken from their parents or, afraid of being outed to their parents, and that really impedes the support that people can get. And then there's a lot of lack of understanding I'm hearing from service providers too. So when people are going for help, they're not getting the support that they need. So that includes, trans folks being terrified of making a police report, that some of the things established that are supposed to be helpful, like foster care, are actually really unhelpful and unsafe for trans folks, which is going to lead to fewer people asking for the help that they need and the support that they need and not reporting violence. Yeah, thank you all for this. Again, keep going in the chat. So on this slide, want to just bring up that when inequality increases, what we see around the world is that violence also goes up. And so with all of the anti-trans stuff right now, we're seeing massive increases in inequality as well as violence. And that ends up linking all of these things in different bubbles. So oppression is not just anti-trans oppression, but racism, ableism, ageism, classism, all of that are connected to interpersonal hate violence, to a hostile culture that denies people resources and others people, keeping us from getting community with each other. And also leads to increased rates of sexual violence and intimate partner violence, legal discrimination, harmful disinformation. And then as I see also, reflected in the chat, the impacts of that can be huge on people's mental health and well-being. And keeps folks from accessing support and care that they need. So we really want to understand, where a lot of this is coming from, and we all have different roles in kind of stopping this process. But if we're looking at our services, when we are working to make things more equitable, more equal, we are hopefully working towards decreasing the amount of violence that's happening in the world. So y'all have started to name some of these themes already, but the impact of hate. So we've gotten kind of that context. What are some of the impacts that you're seeing in your work of this level of anti-trans hate? I know the last comment we got, I think, was for the last question, but applies here too. It's that as a foster care case manager, seeing foster parents pass on taking a child because the child was trans. So again, the huge impacts on that kid's safety and well-being, what access to resources they have based on whether or not they're able to connect with foster parents. Yeah. What other impacts are y'all seeing? People are scared to come in for services and care, increased anxiety, and including the presidential election in that. Yeah. Anytime we're seeing um, change in politics or the potential for change, presidential elections, as well as like every legislative session, we see increased anxiety. Um, Parents. So here we're seeing parents that are on kind of the anti-trans spectrum or who are worried about their children possibly being gay or trans, um, kind of attacking our programming in schools, mental health effects, employment effects, income effects. Absolutely. Um, and thank you. I see some people sharing their personal experiences too of having this impact our ability to keep jobs or to set boundaries for ourselves about whether or not we correct people on pronouns or possibly our names, worrying we'll lose community connections. We'll talk about some of the things our organizations can do around that too. Um, yeah, encouraging isolation. Thank you. And thank you all for responding to each other in the chat. Um, so I'm going to talk through a few, and I think y'all have named some of them and touched on some that we don't even have listed here. But one major impact we're seeing is that we're seeing an increase in domestic and sexual violence. So laws that such as like bans on students in sports are often taking away bodily autonomy. Many of the proposed bans have included ways to like check if somebody is trans or not. And I put that in quotation marks because like, you can't tell by looking at a person's body. That's weird and gross. But they often include like ways that adults can look at the genitals of children, which is really like not something that we want to be endorsing in the anti-sexual violence world, right? The one of our biggest parts of consent education is that kids should get to say who touches and who looks at their bodies, right? And so we're teaching, if we pass these laws and if we enforce these laws, it's teaching children that adults are allowed to access their body, and it's teaching adults to be allowed to access bodies and teaching adults that they have the right to this information on children or on other adults, because we're seeing similar scrutiny of adult athletes. So there's a lot of kind of just taking away the bodily autonomy here that impacts kids and can make it really difficult for kids to participate in school or in sports. And sports, even not at a major competitive level, have such a profound positive influence on kids' mental health to be a part of a team, to get to do physical activity, things like that. Another way that we're seeing increases in domestic and sexual violence is through bathroom policies. So some of the laws that are being proposed are dictating who's allowed to use which bathroom, and typically makes it very hard for trans people to use affirming bathrooms or to be safe using bathrooms. And at least one study has found that there's been increases in sexual violence that trans kids are experiencing when they are forced to use the wrong bathroom. So these laws do not make bathrooms safer, they make them more dangerous, and they specifically make them more dangerous for trans folks. Um, it takes away a safe place. And again, these policies encourage people to scrutinize and harass other people rather than to have a community where it's like, oh, you're going to pee, great. Do that. We are also seeing, that there is a lot of homicide of trans folks, particularly, as someone mentioned before, of trans women of color. Um, in 2023, of the murders of trans people that the HRC was able to track, um, where there were known killers, 36% of victims were killed by a romantic or sexual partner, friend, or family member. These statistics are not perfect. We're not able to track all of the homicides of trans folks because of how much misgendering happens. And often those homicides get less um, care and effort in figuring out what happened. And so we often don't know the relationship between the killer and the victim. Um, but we do know that a lot of these are happening by people that are known and cared for by the victim. Other impacts we're seeing are kind of a misuse and of anti-violence language. So the anti-domestic violence, anti-sexual violence fields have worked really hard to address like how people talk about violence. And we've seen a ton of changes over time. And in order to create words to describe abuse, intimate partner violence, things like that, and name what's happening, and that has a lot of power. But what we're seeing is that instead, anti-trans folks are co-opting those words and turning them to mean something that they're not supposed to mean. So we're seeing way more use of words like groomer, predator, or pedophile to refer to trans people just existing. Um, and I can tell you, trans people just existing is not doing any of that stuff. Um, and those are words that, folks had developed specifically to be able to talk about tactics of child abuse. And instead, they're being turned against trans people. We have this quote from, I think like 2 years ago from Greg Abbott, who said, "There's no doubt that these procedures are, quote, abuse under Texas law and thus must be halted. DFPS has a responsibility to act accordingly. I'll do everything I can to protect against those who take advantage of and harm young Texans." And the procedures he was talking about are being trans affirming to kids. So taking what's best practice of letting trans kids be themselves and supporting them in that and helping them get access to healthcare that meets their needs. Greg Abbott was calling abuse and trying to take kids away from their parents. So that's just one example of the tons of ways we're seeing this language get misused, which then can lead to confusion about the work that we're doing when we say, we're working to end abuse, or we're working to, stop child abuse, like creates confusion about what we're talking about. Another huge thing that we're seeing is the blocking of prevention education. Uh, so folks who work in prevention have worked really hard to establish programs to get education and information to young people. And in and now, and especially for the past 3 or 4 years, we've been seeing more and more policies that ban certain topics, including LGBTQ plus lives and identities, ban any conversation of sex, And often that gets overbroadened to ban any conversation about consent because people assume consent is only about sex. Um, we see bans on talking about race, gender, oppression, um, social emotional learning, the names of body parts, or even menstruation. And all of those topics are stuff that are really helpful for kids to learn about so that they can ask questions, so that they can learn to set boundaries, so that they can show care for others, so they can respect the boundaries and identities and lives of others. Um, but instead, they're being banned from schools. The effect that these are having is a lot of fear. Often the policies get written in really vague ways. So we're afraid to have our programs kicked out of schools, to lose community partners, and like often rightfully so. But sometimes we don't know what exactly it is we're allowed to do or not do, and that can create more fear and more confusion. This can create silence where it's just forbidden to talk about it, or oversimplified messages, where instead of getting into kind of the nitty gritty details of how to get along with people and how to respect boundaries, all we're allowed to say is, "Oh, you should be nice to each other." Sometimes it means no prevention education at all. I know in Florida, we've seen a lot of schools just stop offering it, even though, it's a required topic. We've also seen a lot of restrictions on who teaches prevention education. So maybe it's being changed to be a teacher at the school. Often, certain organizations may not be allowed to come into schools anymore, things like that. So we're seeing tons of impact here, which is an important part of our programming. And another major impact we're seeing is access being denied. And I know y'all mentioned seeing this too. But anti-trans legislation has occasionally been specifically targeting domestic and sexual violence organizations, and sometimes it targets those organizations, more generally as part of like anyone that receives government funds, maybe. And it does this sometimes by defining man and woman, and acting like those are the only two things that exist, which is not true. And then further dictating who can be sheltered where. So some laws are trying to require, sex segregated and gender segregated shelters, and saying, this is who's allowed in men's facilities and this is who's allowed in women's facilities, which are really forcing trans folks to not use affirming facilities or sometimes not be able to access facilities at all. Some places are requiring the use of legal names and sex that are on birth certificates, making it harder or impossible to change gender markers or even change names, going back on name changes. And, we see that having not being able to have affirming or matching ID can create a lot of complications in trans folks' lives. Some states are trying to block staff training and control what staff at different organizations can be trained on. So, again, Florida is one of the many ones that has tried that, to say if you get government funding, you can't require staff to get training on LGBT topics, on race and racism, on diversity at all. And that makes it really hard to operate and to make sure that your staff get trainings like this, or, have education in order to be able to serve everybody. And some of the state by state laws, in fact, many of them contra contradict federal non-discrimination policies. So almost all of us are probably receiving federal funds in some way. So we might have VAWA or HHS non-discrimination policies, which say that we have to have equitable services to folks of all genders. And if things are sex segregated, that they have to still be equitable for everyone. And these policies contradict a lot of those, and make it way harder to do that. And it's putting people in tough positions. Um, One example of this is in Kansas, where Kansas imposed the most sweeping anti-trans bathroom law in the nation. And this applied to explicitly applied to domestic violence services, and may prohibit people from attending programs. So the quote here by Micah Kubik is, "The lack of clarity is by design because it allows them to disclaim the worst possible interpretation while also allowing for the worst possible outcome to happen." And this is likely what a lot of us have been seeing if you're following along with legislation. It's like, what does that even mean? And so some of that's on purpose to kind of make it confusing and make it so that people are possibly getting rid of programs kind of preemptively because they're afraid of getting in trouble. And all of that is really leading to increased trauma on folks. So seeing this happening in the world, not being able to access services increases the trauma that we experience. Um, for survivors, people are experiencing, again, possibly more violence, as well as just like more negative experiences and knowing that people in their community are having a harder time. This can increase the trauma responses that we have. It's also increasing distrust of providers, especially in places where providers are having to constantly change their policies or may not be able to be um, as trans affirming as they were or deciding not to be. That's creating a lot of distrust. And it's making it so that survivors can't get help that they need, which again is traumatizing in and of itself to try to get support and be denied that care. Another thing we see in survivors is polyvictimization, which is multiple forms of violence across the lifespan. So people are experiencing lots of different forms of violence. And when it comes to domestic and sexual violence services, that's really something that we want to think about because sometimes we get into our own little boxes or bubbles and we want to care for the whole survivor and all of their experiences as much as possible. We also know all of this is having a huge impact on staff. I can see in that chat the ways that y'all are sharing that you've been impacted by it. We know that organizations and people and advocates across the country are, many of us as advocates are also trans or non-binary. So we're experiencing all of this trauma and this harm too, as well as all of us of all genders in our staff roles are experiencing exhaustion, um, sometimes distrust of others. We might have heightened conflict or tension with other staff in our programs, not knowing where they stand on this, or more distrust of other community partners who are not trans affirming. We're seeing really high rates of burnout, and we're seeing a lot of disruption of work. Some of that comes from exhaustion and burnout and not having enough staff. And some of it is because, um, as y'all have shared in the chat, like programs are getting shut down. Maybe they're defunded. Maybe they're being kicked out of schools. Maybe we're just afraid to have them anymore. So that's been really disruptive. And we're seeing people be um, as individuals and as organizations being harassed or attacked. Um, and that can be really upsetting as well as potentially unsafe for folks. I've heard from folks that it's kind of across the board, like their training evaluations are worse because because of anti-trans attitude and the trainer is trans. And that has a huge effect on possibly that person's ability to keep their job, even though they're doing a good job training. The anti-trans hate is being used against them in those ways. So we're going to shift to talk about what can we do. Um, And I'm just going to take a second while y'all think about, what you're already doing and what you can do. I just want to take a second and check out what's in the chat to see if I've missed um, anything we need to read out loud. Caleb, feel free to hop on if you've seen questions and stuff.
Not seeing questions. I see a comment about living in conservative religious area, which makes safety planning with LGBTQ plus clients difficult without affirming resources locally, especially for trans folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're sadly seeing, a lot of trans affirming places or gender affirming care and clinics be shut down due to state laws, people having to travel even further and further for that care. Um, I also want to highlight this, how many students come up and say they appreciate our presence and support of the queer and trans community. And I've heard that from survivors too, of just like really, even if the advocate they work with out of a center isn't trans, like knowing there's trans staff there has been such a boost to them. Um, so those are some great things that we are doing. Our presence and existence matters. So kind of a framework I want to use for thinking about what we can do is this idea of an ecosystem of care. And A, I'm from Florida, so I love the ocean. But B, I just thought this was like a really beautiful picture of coral reefs and like an ecosystem. So ecosystems, when they're thriving, often have a lot of different life in them, and life that plays different roles. So plants and animals and air and water and stuff that all works together, but are all unique and get to be themselves in their own ways. So when we think about like how can we make change, we know that like we're not all going to do the same thing. We get to kind of figure out what roles work for us as individuals, as well as what work roles make sense for our agencies and organizations, and then how we can show up and do that. Some of these strategies are going to be things that take a really long time to see change come from them. And some of these strategies might be like quick and faster growing, and both of those are necessary. And again, we're kind of thinking about how do we um, decrease inequality so that we can decrease violence. And I see y'all are already starting to answer this, which is great. So some of the things you are already doing to support your community, to manage trauma responses, um, I see set the example of how to treat trans folks. Yeah. Um, and especially when we're in any kind of public facing role, if survivors are seeing how we talk to our coworkers or how we talk to other survivors, what we're modeling makes a big difference, and both helps people learn how to be respectful, but it also shows folks like, hey, other people are being respected here, maybe I will be too. I'm seeing mutual aid and deep community care. I love it. Being our most authentic selves allows others to be their most authentic selves too. Absolutely. So finding the ways that it's safe for us to do that, talking with our organizations, um, moving outside of my job and our systems to give impactful care, stating names and pronouns in events and outreach, expanding Spanish speaking resources, trans art, um, arting, musicking, holding systems of oppression accountable, fully leaning in to stand up for vulnerable or harmed folks in our community. I love it. Um, and then meeting them where they are and validating their feelings. That's a great transition to the next slide of, so some of the stuff we do is really concretely when we're supporting survivors, right? Meeting folks where they are, validating their feelings, includes acknowledging the harm of hate. So whatever kind of our role is, we can still acknowledge like all of this other stuff that sucks in the world and sucks in somebody's life. And that might be as simple as saying, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's really terrible. Or I know the world is really crappy right now. Um, how do you want to talk about it? How are you doing? Um, I know that it's impacted a lot of folks. Um, so just acknowledging that this does impact us in our lives. We can increase safety planning. I think I have a slide specifically on safety planning in a minute, as I know that that can be hard to increase. Um, but part of what we do when we increase it is include hate violence in our risk assessments and our safety plans. So, for example, thinking about how but we often talk with survivors about transportation, right? Like, how can you safely get from one place to another if maybe you're being stalked? And that might include changing your routes or taking a different bus, things like that. But how do we add into that the lens of like, where is it safe and how is it safe for trans folks to travel in your area? A lot of folks are experiencing harassment at bus stops. Does public transportation feel like a viable option for this person? And if not, what other options exist? On the other hand, some folks, some trans and non-binary people have had really bad experiences with ride shares. So that may not be an option for them. It's going to vary person to person, area to area. But in those ways, we're incorporating not just the abuse, the domestic violence or sexual violence abuse, but also the broader community context in our safety planning. We often have to get creative with our resources. Um, Support groups are a great resource. Other things that we have, we want to make sure that we have clothing that works for a wide range of body sizes and types. We want to think more creatively about like how can we get people cash assistance or financial support. Um, does do they need certain types of healthcare or gender affirming um, items and clothes? Do they need to get out of state? Is that what's safest, or is it safest for them not to relocate because they live in the neighborhood, right? And maybe this is the one place in town where they do feel safe. So how can we help them keep their housing? We have to kind of rethink some of these resource strategies. And then what we want to do is help survivors feel like they're supported at our organization. This is both through our actions and our words. So y'all have talked about introducing ourselves with names and pronouns, having inclusive intake forms, having inclusive signs and outreach materials, all of that. Having staff that that are trans and non-binary or supportive of trans and non-binary folks. All of these things are ways that we can demonstrate it, as well as when we're working with folks one-on-one to be able to meet them where they're at, to listen and hear from them, their experiences, and not stigmatize them or make them feel bad. Um, so those are some of the ways that we show up and support survivors. Another thing that we want to do is really support our staff. Um, So hopefully we've got trans and non-binary staff. There are resources out there about how to diversify your hiring if that's something that you need. But showing support can look like making sure that all staff have the opportunity to share their names and pronouns, that you check in with staff before you create their email address so that you're using their affirming name and um, not just defaulting to legal names. That tip especially is really helpful in domestic and sexual violence because not everybody wants their their full name or their last name or something like that in their email address, particularly when working in a community that you live in. So always just check with people. We can create meaningful workplace policies for inclusion. Some of this looks like HR stuff, like health insurance, the way that we pay people. But it's also, do we make sure that like using folks' affirming name is part of our standard policies? Do we uh, help to ensure that folks are educated about trans issues? and things like that as generally part of the expectations for the workplace. Organizations can also you kind of plan ahead and talk with stakeholders and partners. Sometimes some of the like anti-trans pushback is coming from some of our community partners. And so if we can get out in front of it and we can say, hey, we're an affirming place and this is why it's so great. Join us and get on board. We can talk to funders about why it's so important that we have gender integrated services and what that's meant for our community and for supporting survivors. All of those things can be really helpful. Um, this can also help with things like community outreach or prevention education. If we talk to the school board ahead of time before a parent complains, sometimes we can get the school board to have already be on board with the process. It doesn't always work, but it can help. Other ways to support staff, making sure that staff know they can talk about how the world is impacting them. Um, and that's not just around trans stuff, that's around everything. Don't force your staff to talk about stuff, but letting folks know that they have the option and that management is aware that the world impacts staff and that staff are people too, which leads to being flexible. The more we can have flexible policies around, workplace expectation, the time that people are there, taking breaks, excuse me, stuff like that, the more we can kind of take care of our staff's well-being, all staff, including trans and non-binary folks. Um, and another, like a specific resource here, the ABA Commission, the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, in partnership with others, created this resource guide for coalitions. Anyone can read it. You don't have to be at a coalition. But it's talking about how to navigate anti-trans rhetoric and discrimination as domestic sexual violence and dual coalitions. So it gives some tips and tools for communication, how to understand like legislation and policies that are happening and then how to communicate about them, which can be really helpful for just learning like what rhetoric's being used, um, and where things are. Like, is this a policy that is in place and being enforced? Is this something people are thinking about and we want to try to keep from happening? That sort of thing. Right. And I'm seeing some other tips in the chat that we've got of making changes to be more inclusive with support group and outreach, um, doing a comprehensive training for member agencies on working with LGBTQ survivors, talking to individuals about pronouns and names, and you're really making clear to them why it's so important. Great. Um, and then thinking about how we build relationships within trans communities. So sometimes that's through word of mouth, and really being strategic. And yeah, I will echo like often what we see is that folks in kind of any smaller community or marginalized community often talk to each other, and so your reputation can say a lot. Um, and strategic outreach can make a big difference there. It is okay to kind of think about and have different levels of, how do we describe stuff? We might have support groups that, are all gender support groups around sexual violence, and we don't always use all those words in the description because some people don't want other people to know what they're going to. But as long as we're making it clear to the folks who want and need it, that they are included, that they are welcome, using those strategic language can make sense just based on your audience. A couple other things that we can do: really recognize how our work is connected. So we want to look for connection between issues. Similar today, we've talked about some of the connections between anti-trans hate violence and sexual violence, domestic violence. Um, and by seeing those connections, that can both help us support survivors, because the connections are real in the lives of survivors, right? Um, and it can also help us when we're thinking about like how do we structure our programs? Who do we build partnerships with? We can be connected to folks we may not have been connected to in the past. We do want to pay attention to federal and local policies. Um, we've seen that a lot of policy around education, around healthcare, as well as explicit policies around LGBTQ stuff are having massive impacts on the work of domestic violence and sexual violence advocates. Um, and so kind of looking across the board for what are those things? What are the changes the Department of Education is making or the Department of Health? Uh, Learning media literacy. There's unfortunately so much misinformation out there about trans folks, about what's happening in the world. So learning how to assess the information we're getting, and figure out kind of what's true and what's not and what's biased and how it's biased. And then sharing what we learned can be really helpful. So that might be in one-on-one conversations, maybe with a coworker. You could say like, "Oh, actually, this isn't true. I heard that that was. Here's how I found out that this piece of news is misinformation, and that never happened." Um, so you're kind of helping people build the skills of assessing stuff for themselves in the future. We can also share our values. Similar to like being our authentic selves as it's safe is when we're expressing, that equity, inclusion, that um, being trans affirming are core to who we are, to the services that we have. That can be really helpful for people to know, and it supports other people who maybe were afraid to say like, yes, that's what they believe too. And along with that is kind of being realistic about our risk assessments. There's a lot of fear out there right now, both from trans folks as well as organizations and agencies that support trans folks about what will happen. Will we lose our funding or not? Will we lose our partnerships or not? Some of those risks are really real and are happening to folks. And sometimes we're really afraid that something's going to happen that's really unlikely to happen. So just kind of taking the time to react from a place that's more grounded and based in what our experiences are, what the laws and policies that have passed in our area are, can help us when we're trying to decide what kind of actions as an organization we want to take. And with that said, when it's safe to do so, being bold can be really helpful. Organizations that are willing to say, like, those laws are unacceptable. We are going to support trans folks here, can make a huge difference, both in the lives of trans folks and the trust you build with trans communities, as well as in helping prevent, some of the worst policy decisions from happening. um, and making sure our services are accessible to everyone. Um, that includes being clear about it. Um, we serve people of all genders. One of the super common things that we hear from trans folks is they don't know if domestic or sexual violence organizations will welcome them. They don't know if that or if organizations are just for cisgender women or not, and maybe don't know how to find out or how to believe the information that they're seeing. So our work as advocates can be in sharing clearly who we serve, um, so that people know and don't have to be as afraid to call and ask, or seek out our support. We can increase security and safety without increasing policing. Um, so, um, often as we see like attacks on organizations, threats to organizations, I know We're also in the DBNSA world, we see um, threats from abusers if our location is known, stuff like that. Taking security risks seriously is important, but we can do that in ways that maybe don't increase policing and specifically the presence of law enforcement. In a recent survey, the 2022 U.S. Trans Survey, 73% of respondents said that they would be uncomfortable asking law enforcement for help if they needed it. There are so many negative experiences that trans folks and survivors of all kinds have had with police that we really want to think about how we can take care of safety in other ways. Some of that might be, making sure that our staff doesn't have to walk to their cars alone. It can be rethinking, how we share staff members' names and information. Often DBNSA organizations are pretty good already on the privacy of staff, but kind of doing an assessment of what do we need to change, for um, yeah, maybe you want just people's last names to not be as publicly out there, or you will just want to check with people before you use their full names for stuff. Could be one example of a change that might be made. In terms of services, expanding what we offer rather than limiting it, and providing trans affirming services can be really important. So, having gender integrated support groups, having gender integrated shelters, having more rather than less as a response, can help make sure that trans folks and everyone keeps having access. And then train and support our staff. Y'all have been so amazing of being at this training today. And please keep sending your staff. You'll get the recording. But there's so much we can train on, not just trans and non-binary cultural responsiveness, but really being able to recognize all of the cultures of the folks that we serve. And just remember, there's so many different ways that we can show inclusion. Here are two pictures, one of two reverends holding a sign that says trans folks are blessed, and another is one that says washroom for everyone. So whatever the way it is that you're able to show inclusion through gender neutral bathrooms, through, simple signs, through, statements like trans folks are blessed to pronoun pens, anything like that can all be so useful. And again, as we get close to closing, I just want to circle back to kind of these key principles. So as you're making decisions about what you can do to integrate an awareness of hate violence, to support survivors, to support your staff, kind of remembering to believe survivors, recognize connections, and create a culture of care are really important themes throughout whatever decision making we're doing, and can help us assess, will this decision move us towards equity and less violence, or is it going to move us towards separation, towards oppression, or exclusion? I want to give some time for questions and conversation. I, this is a chance for y'all. What are other things that you're struggling with that it would be helpful for us to talk through? Are there questions about things I've shared? Any scenarios you want to share with the group? Um, since we have so much beautiful expertise in this room. And we got one comment in from a bit earlier that I'd like to read out. Risk assessment to take bolder risks with holistic considerations rather than to avoid risk is a reframe I found incredibly important for building collective care. I love that. So again, we use the risk assessment, rather than we will never experience risk in our lives, but how can we be holistic in our understanding of the risks and take those risks. And what do we need to take those risks? Right. All right. One question, any trans youth resources you can offer? Um, and trainings for school counselors for how to support trans youth. I'm going to put my email in the chat. There are a, a lot of resources out there really broadly. If you're in a specific place and want place specific resources, if you could email me and folks can share. But there's a number of kind of youth based organizations, Trevor Project. There's a like a gender affirming family organization whose name I'm blanking on that provides stuff generally. And then a lot of like state equality organizations do stuff for schools. I know in Florida, at least Equality Florida has done some stuff for school counselors and has been really keeping track of school organizations. So, looking for anyone kind of checking out your state's equality organization to see what laws and policies they're tracking and what resources they provide to families. Um, PFLAG is another. Again, it's PFLAG can be very locally based. It's parents and friends of lesbians and gays. I don't know if they've updated. I think they updated it to just be PFLAG now. Um, but just depending on who the local folks are, they may also have a ton of resources for kind of parents and youth and thus for schools. And other folks feel free to shout things out and I'll send follow-up email. Other questions, things y'all are thinking about? Listen, thank you for this comment. So one person says, when I go to a medical facility that asks for preferred name and then doesn't use mine, I tell them that just pisses me off, but it can be traumatizing to trans people. Yeah, I we hear that too. Like, um, I know we did a bunch of listening sessions last year, and somebody had this great quote about like, why are you even asking for that if you're not going to use it? Um, and that's a great way to show support too, is like there doesn't have to be a trans person in the room for you to show support for trans people. So when you notice stuff like that and are safe to speak up about it, that is really great. Thank you for doing that. Um, Right. And if y'all have more questions, keep typing them in, but I'll share some of our resources. If you aren't already following us on social media, please do so if you use these. We are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and we've got a ton of recorded webinars and resources on our YouTube channel. And those are all in the chat and we can send them out later too. We also have our main website, which has a ton of resources for service providers. And then we have transsurvivors.com, which is a blog that really focuses on trans survivors and writings for and by trans folks. This is me. I love talking to people. So email me. Happy to follow up from anything that we talked about here today. Happy to hear your feedback or questions or, help you build connections with other folks. And again, Caleb's put that in the chat. And I think, I don't think I sent Caleb the evaluation for today, but when you close Zoom, the evaluation is going to pop up. And we're also going to email it to you tomorrow. So please, oh, you do have it. Great. It's also in the chat. Please fill out the evaluation. That helps us do what we do better. And we really take seriously being able to learn and grow. So we want to be sure that we get your feedback and whatever other topics you like. Thank you all so much for the work you do. I just really appreciate, I know I didn't get to read every chat out loud, but I loved reading through them and I'm going to go back and look at it and hope you all got information and ideas from each other because we're all all connected and can help create this, safer world for everyone with that work together. Have a great rest of your day, y'all. And we look forward to talking to you again either by email or through another training that you can attend. And please keep doing the great work that you're doing. Take care of yourselves.